Welcome to the Divorce Podcast, where we explore all aspects of ending relationships, separation, and parenting apart. If your marriage or partnership has ended, or you have friends and family who are separating, this podcast is for you. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor, divorce specialist, and co-founder of Amicable, the online legal service for separating couples. In each episode, we look at relationships and separation from different angles, including the emotional, legal, and social. I'm joined by experts and special guests who share their own unique stories, experience, and tips, with the goal of helping people end relationships in a kinder and better way. In this episode, I'm joined by Allison O'Brien, a communication and leadership development consultant, to discuss techniques for communicating with an ex-partner and why some people might need more time to get on board with the idea of an amicable divorce. We start with hearing the personal story of Allison's parents' separation and then her own experience of a relationship breakdown. She shares how her professional skills helped her through her divorce and in establishing a positive co-parenting relationship. We move on to discuss the pushback that Allison received after her TED Talk, How to Divorce as Allies, Not Enemies, was released, and what problems we're all still facing as a society that make the concept of an amicable, collaborative divorce just so hard to accept. Allison finishes with some expert tips on communicating with an ex-partner to remain civil and to be a good co-parent. Definitely not one to miss. If you loved this episode, then please subscribe and rate us on your preferred listening platform. Welcome, Allison.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you, and I'm really interested to dig into how you can have a professional skill that you can turn on yourself in the most dramatic of times when you're going through a divorce and separation. So I'm really looking forward to getting into this. But why don't you start, if you would, by just giving us a little bit of background about what sort of led you to here, your own divorce, your sort of career, how it all came together in one space, and perhaps a little bit about your early experiences of divorce.
Sure. Well, it's funny. I didn't necessarily intentionally use the concepts from my work in my divorce process, but I think because I live them so deeply, they just really helped through the process. I think anyone going through it can really resonate with the concept that it's so challenging. There's so much pain, regardless of who chose to initiate the process. If you're in it, there is just so much pain, and it's a tremendous loss. And part of that is the narrative around divorce in general. But I think my approach, given the principles that I teach in my work, was just a natural progression to some extent. When we visceralize and really internalize some of these principles around genuine desire to understand when there's conflict, that's a foundational, I don't want to say life skill necessarily, but if we live that in any kind of conflict, it's useful. Just that genuine desire to understand another perspective and seek to find some kind of intersection between various viewpoints. And that was really the approach that I used in my divorce process, because I was really oriented towards a peaceful future.
Right. So you had that goal to start with, though. So you knew that you wanted to have a peaceful, and is that because of a personality thing or a practical, we have children, therefore we've got to thing? What drove that desire for the peaceful outcome?
Oh, it's such a great question. There are so many factors, and I'll try and bullet point them. I was the byproduct of a very nasty divorce. So growing up as a child, I lived the conflict between my parents. They weren't in the same room at the same time for probably close to 8 to 10 years after their initial separation. And by the time I got married, 25 years later, they had maybe been in the same place at the same time half a dozen times. My brothers actually think that that's an overestimate of how many times they'd been in the same place at the same time. So So many of the experiences that should have been joyful in our lives between my brothers and myself just weren't as celebratory as they should have been or could have been, because there was so much stress for us around that conflict between our parents. So when I found myself in the situation of going down that path of separating and divorcing my husband, I knew I had a very strong conviction that I wanted it to be different for my children. I wanted both of their parents to be there synchronously celebrating them and supporting them in really important times in their lives. I wanted to feel peaceful through the process. I didn't want to go through the rest of my life hating someone that it was so important for me to be able to communicate with. Every single thing involving our children is so much easier because we can have conversations that are kind and respectful and peaceful. So I'm so grateful for that. And I'm so proud of it.
Yeah, it is something to be massively proud of, isn't it? And there's something as you're talking, it's everybody would want that on paper. So, an amicable divorce on paper is an absolute no-brainer, isn't it? Nobody would go into a situation where they wanted to fight. People feel that they're forced to or compelled to. And I'm just wondering if, because you've seen the fallout of what that means for a child, that gives you something that goes above and beyond your own self to be able to have that real strength of vision, because there must have been very testing times along the way. I'm sure there could have been easily times where you over attribute an action out of malice, where it's just something somebody forgot or didn't think about. And it's very easy when you're in that divorce perspective or relationship breakdown perspective, isn't it, to over attribute motive to things that are just accidents or forgetfulness or inconsideration. But we seem to get very caught up in our own sort of hurt feelings and escalate those things where we need to be damping them down. So is it the strength of the vision, or is it a strength of will that you think enabled you to overcome those things, or something different?
That's a very thoughtful question. For me personally, I think what really helped me was assuming responsibility in my part of the dysfunction that got us to where we are or were in the relationship. So I really truly believe, and I said this in my TED talk, that when two people come together, they create a dynamic. And sometimes that dynamic is perfectly dysfunctional. My former husband and I brought out that piece in one another that exacerbated the dysfunction in each other. And so in realizing that I played a big role in our dysfunction, it was much easier to be kinder in the process because there was no blame on my part. I wasn't blaming my former husband for how we got to where we were. I recognized fully that I was just as much of the dynamic that we created. I think that, for me anyway, softened me in the process. Just assuming accountability.
What do you say then to people where it's perhaps trickier not to be blaming the other person? So where there's been abuse or where there's been an affair, can you get to that same place in a psychologically safe way for yourself, do you think?
I would never want anyone to believe that I think that the way I accomplished my divorce process is possible in every case scenario. If there's violence, if there's abuse, I don't know that it's possible. I do believe it's possible if there's an affair. And here's why. And I know that I get a lot of pushback on that. And there was some real negative commentary and narrative as a result of my talk. I do believe that with an affair, we can find that place of forgiveness if the number one priority is the mental health and well-being of our children. And I say that because the studies show that in a high conflict divorce situation, children are twice as likely to suffer from emotional, behavioral, academic issues, addiction. And so it's so critically important, I think, to put aside our pain and our suffering in favor of supporting our children. If you talk to almost any parent and you say, how do you feel about your children? They say things along the lines of, they're the most important thing to me. I would die for my children. I would do anything for my children. And then I think, well, would you put aside your pain, a lifetime of fighting and hatred in honor of them?
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? That's the nub of the question.
Yeah. And it's not easy. It's very, very difficult to forgive. But, one of the tools kind of in my toolbox when I got very triggered, and my former husband, Ben, he'll say the same thing. We triggered each other constantly through our process. It was excruciatingly difficult. And in the midst of it, my main goal was to have the most generous assumptions. So being able to pause and say, this is what I'm observing. This is what I'm feeling. But what if I were to have the most generous assumptions about Ben's behavior, his motive, his intention? And whether I was right or not didn't really matter, because just believing that there was a better intention or a generous assumption about that scenario helped me.
I think that's exactly it, isn't it? It's the bit where, like I was saying before, you've got a situation where it's very easy in a divorce and separation or a relationship breakdown for the worst to be the assumption, isn't it? To give that idea that, oh, they've done that because of whatever. And you're in your head, you're thinking the worst, and all of a sudden you're right at the top of the scale very quickly. And it's very hard to come down from that. But you're absolutely spot on. If the question is, what if I assume the opposite of what I might be feeling and give that generous interpretation? What if that is the motivation? And I think if you can do that, you give yourself that little bit of space to respond rather than react as well, don't you, in the motivation? Because you get hijacked by the worst case scenario. But the best case scenario, if it does nothing else, and like you say, it doesn't have to be real, it just buys you the time not to escalate.
Absolutely. And I teach this in my work when we have teams in conflict, which is that we often judge other people by what we perceive in their actions, but we judge ourselves by our intentions. So what if we were to flip that and we were to judge others by our assumption of a good or a positive intention, or even just assuming that our partner just doesn't have the tools in the moment to manage well? And can we be a little bit more graceful in how we receive that versus respond to it? I think there's something really empowering in being able to manage our emotions when we are so triggered. And it really does build. I think there's this inertia with it. The more that we can manage our emotions and stay reasonable and rational, the easier every subsequent challenging conversation becomes.
And it's like a superpower, isn't it? If you can do it, it is then a superpower because you've cracked it almost, haven't you? If you don't have to react and you can respond, you've just got 10 times more likelihood of coming out with an agreement or without the anger, without the negativity. And as you say, that then has the huge impact on the children. You mentioned just at the beginning of that sort of chat a bit about some of the pushback you've got, and you did a TED talk. They pushed it out on Valentine's Day. without going into, I will put the link to the TED Talk so people can visit it in full, but without going into, all of the nitty-gritty of what you said, what was the pushback and what do you think that says about attitudes around divorce and whether or not they've changed over the years?
Yeah, I was actually really surprised. They say you should never read the comments. And
I never do.
to be honest, it didn't bother me. I found it very interesting, but some of the pushback was I made a suggestion that divorce isn't necessarily a failure, that there isn't shame in ending a marriage if it's done in an intentional way. There was a lot of pushback to that. I think there's this narrative that ending a marriage and that divorce is something shameful and that it is a failure. And it's interesting to me that negativity around me sharing something so positive was so misunderstood. I think there was an assumption that I was advocating for divorce.
Yeah, that's what we get. Yeah. If you say it can be done in a kind way and it can be a sad, not a bad. And for some people, it's not even sad. It's an opportunity. It's a new beginning, that we live longer, that we're more likely to have lots of different relationships. And we need to get better as human beings of passing from one to the next without damage being passed. And you can say all that and people say, oh, so you're trying to make divorce easy. And you're just kind of like, oh, it's never easy. No one's trying to make it easy. No one's trying to say it's a lifestyle choice. Let's all go out and get divorced. We're not trying to encourage or push it. But you're right. That's very different to people having to feel that it's a punitive process or one that they should be ashamed of.
Yeah. And I think that was, for me, part of the impetus for me speaking about it. It was, I never really had the intention to very publicly talk about my divorce or the process, but I did realize 10 years post separation that one of the things I am most proud of in my life is how I handled this and how I managed it and what we have built together now for our kids, because it is so unusual. It is so unusual to be able to sit next to your former spouse and celebrate your children together, to share a holiday together when there are new partners involved. That was some other pushback that I got in the commentary, was around me having a new partner and the fact that my former and my current are actually amicable and can be in the same place at the same time, and that we can share a holiday, etc. I think that this idea that I was advocating for the easy way out.
Yeah, sometimes people feel you've got to stay and suffer, and that's the right thing to do. But with that, I always think, well, you'd never give that advice to your child, would you? You'd never say to your child, oh, stay and suffer. You'd encourage your child to find a reasonable way out. So why would you role model staying and suffering to your children if that's not what you would do? There's just a big disconnect.
Yeah. And, I love what I've created. I love having this partner where there is very low stake to it, but that I know I truly have a thought partner when my children are hurting or they need something, that I don't have to do this alone or in an adversarial way. I'm not saying that we agree on everything. We have very, very different perspectives still, Ben and I. And we're able to have conversations now that we probably weren't able to have when we were married. Again, because the stakes are lower, and I can genuinely be a lot more curious and understanding of a different perspective and see if it actually influences my own. And that happens quite often.
Yeah, I get that all the time. People say when they've been through the amicable process, they're better able to communicate than when they were married, and then they sometimes have a much better relationship. And that's when I find it really rewarding, when you've got people to a place where they can be their best selves, albeit in a different type of relationship, but they're being their better self. And I think that's just a real testament to doing things in an amicable way and coming out the other side, knowing that it's like when you're in the wrong job, isn't it? Like brilliant people can look really rubbish in the wrong job. And it's the same thing. You can look really rubbish in a relationship when it's the wrong relationship, but put yourself in a different relationship and you can shine and thrive. And if you're both shining and thriving, you've got 2, 3, however many, much more happier kids, haven't you? You've got kids who can see two parents thriving, and that's ultimately a much better space. And you know what you're saying about effectively your blended family, you've got more people looking out for your kids, which has got to be a positive thing.
There was another criticism that surprised me that came up frequently, and it was if she could divorce this way so amicably, why couldn't she stay married?
Yeah, we get that too.
And that was interesting to me because at the time, staying married was no longer an option for me. I think that people thought it was hasty, that this came very quickly, that I was just done. But we had been in and out of marriage counseling 6 times over 10 years. And so again, I'm not an advocate for just hastily calling it quits and deciding to leave a committed relationship. We really did try, and it wasn't working.
Don't you think as well, a relationship breakup is like an iceberg? You know, everybody outside of you only sees that little top bit, don't they? But underneath, there's all the years and the trying and the different kind of, behavioral experimenting, whatever you're doing underneath, the relationship therapy, the silences, that's all underneath and nobody gets to see that. Rightly so. So I always think breakups, you can't really look at a breakup from the outside because only the 2 people in the breakup really understand the depth and what's gone on and the time. The time that other people see isn't the real time. It's just that tiny bit on top.
Yeah. And I think no one goes into a relationship and commitment to marrying someone thinking, oh, well, I can just get out of it. We go into it thinking this is forever. I really want this to be my life indefinitely. That said, and this could be controversial, I don't know that I necessarily see divorce as something very sad. I do see it as a loss, but I also see it as it makes sense in that parenting and the practical application of raising children together is so incredibly challenging on the emotional intimacy that we need in a relationship. There is nothing more difficult, I think, on a relationship and rewarding, but adding children to it. And I find that it's more an anomaly when people can do that and for decades and decades maintain their emotional and physical intimacy and have a really rewarding relationship and co-parenting scenario. I think it's the exception rather than the norm. So the ending of a relationship, while it changes the dynamic, I don't always see it as terribly sad because it makes sense to me. Does that?
I think it makes sense to a lot of people when they've come to realize that when you go into a relationship, you're both changing constantly. It's a real bet, isn't it, that you're going to change in a way that continues to make you compatible. So the logic of it says this is unlikely to succeed, doesn't it? And yet we've constructed a world because from a biological perspective, we've decided, or nature's decided, it's easier to have 2. And I guess it is easier to have 2, but do they have to be in the same kind of relationship? But I also think now that there are so many more people who are choosing to have things like different types of families, choosing to have children together but not be in a relationship. There's a lot more solo parenting by choice rather than by accident. And I think those things are really challenging some of these assumptions about you get married, you have children, they leave, you reconnect on some level, and then you spend the rest of your later years together. And I think that's being really fundamentally challenged these days by the way that people live. But I don't think the social narrative has quite caught up yet. So I am not surprised you received those comments because I think we've got a lot more work to do on the social narrative. But I think it's happening. I just don't think lots of people are talking about it in quite the same way because I think they're frightened of being shot down by a sort of the married brigade almost. Yeah.
There was also an element of misogyny in the commentary.
Really? Yeah.
In that there were several comments that were very negative towards women in the divorce process. And that made me sad, in that there is this just narrative that women make out so much better in a divorce than men do, that women have negative intentions with divorce. I was very surprised by that, by the level of misogyny in the comments around it.
And that is a social narrative, isn't it? Because I can't speak for the US, but statistically in the UK, there are reports done every year that show that women are disproportionately financially affected by divorce and do not ever make up in the same way that men do for the financial kind of impact that a divorce has. And women suffer a factor of twice to what men do. So men's incomes post-divorce drop by approximately 22%. Women's incomes drop by approximately 44% in the UK. That's a Legal and General survey of thousands of people that they did on divorce last year. And that research is replicated in lots of different studies. So there was a report from the Nuffield Foundation with Bristol University that found similar things, that even 5, 6, 7 years after a divorce, that women still hadn't recovered their financial position to the same extent that men do. And that's about lots of things. It's all about the gender roles that we have. It's about who cares for the children, not just who physically cares for the children, but who takes the mental load for the children as well. And that's one of my big things, is that we might share care, we might have 50-50 arrangements in terms of time, but we're still not sharing the mental load. And that's why women's time is far more pressured than men's time, even in a shared care arrangement. So there are lots of reasons why that's the case. But it's interesting, as you say, that if you look out there in social media and on comments as you've been receiving them, that's just not recognized or represented in the social commentary that goes alongside with divorce and the impacts on men and women.
Yeah. I think there's also, for some, that the idea of divorce goes against what they fundamentally believe is right, with potentially a religious affiliation. There's significant stigma around it. And, what inspired me to talk about it was this, like I said, this feeling of pride for what we'd built and accomplished, and how well our children have been supported over the last 15 years. And that, to me, was something to share, that it's possible, that it doesn't have to be stigmatized in the way that it is.
You talked a little bit about, some of the tools and techniques that enabled you to maintain this amicable relationship with your ex and to be able to go on and co-parent. You've articulated beautifully the win from being amicable, and the impact that has both negatively on you as a child of divorce and a conflicted divorce versus what you've been able to create for your children. What were some of the ways that you learned, or perhaps not learnt, but deployed around communication? What did you do that you think made a difference?
I think the most critical part of all of it was the understanding of how the brain responds to the perception of threat.
Speak about that then. That's interesting. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. So, there is a portion of our brain called the amygdala. I'm sure you are very aware of this. The amygdala is our always on threat detection system. It is designed to guarantee our safety. So when the human brain perceives a threat, the amygdala gets fired up and responds immediately in 0 to 3 seconds to that perception of threat in either fight, flee, freeze, or appease. Knowing that the amygdala response to the perception of threat, and the threat could be real, someone coming at us with a knife, or a social threat, like being yelled at, being lied to, being diminished in front of people who are important to us. Any of that will create an amygdala hijack. When we are in that moment, we can't think, we can't reason, we can't discern, we certainly can't listen. So being able to recover the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that does all of those things, thinking, reasoning, discerning, can articulate our thoughts. Being able to recover the prefrontal cortex is so critically important in the midst of conflict or when we perceive threat. So having that knowledge was really helpful for me in this process because maintaining emotional agility was so critically important. So I used tools to recover when I perceived threat. The perception of threat and the amygdala hijack is felt physiologically. We just have to tune in and be aware of it. So for me, my bioreactions tend to be freeze and then appease, but generally I'm much more of a freezer than a fighter. Some people are fighters.
Definitely a fighter.
Yeah. And whatever the threat or the bioreaction is could create a different response from us. So for example, if someone lies to me, I might fight back. If someone yells at me, I might freeze. Knowing this, that how we respond to the perception of threat is so important for the quality or the outcome of the conversation. It was so important to me to be able to manage my emotions and recover my prefrontal cortex quickly. So I used a tool, which I call the go-to question. And the go-to question is a question that we ask either ourselves internally, or it could be an external question. It's a little bit more difficult that way, but this internal question, anytime I felt a physiological response or bioreaction. So my go-to, and the thing is, we can't try to ask ourselves a different question depending on the situation. We have to have one question that we use universally. My question was always, what am I missing? What do I need to know that I don't know now? So I would feel the physiological response, and that was my immediate go-to. What am I missing? What do I need to know that I don't know now? So one, it bought me time. We need a minimum of 10 to 14 seconds to recover our prefrontal cortex. But so it bought me time. That was one thing. But then the other thing it did for me was it shifted me into more of that curiosity, generous assumption mindset. So I'm responding to this. I am triggered. And is there something at play here that I don't understand yet that is responsible for what I'm observing or perceiving or that he's doing right now? So that was exceptionally helpful to me. What am I missing? It allowed me to then shift to be able to ask questions externally to Ben. Questions that would allow me again to buy more time, to hear more, to learn more. So that was critical for me as learning. And so I would frequently ask, what's important to you in this?
All right. So I was going to say, does Ben play ball in a way with this? Does he have to be a certain type of person, or does this work when he's not playing ball? I don't want to personalize it to him, but if you think about those scenarios and you're in control of you can ask those questions for you. Do you need a certain level of cooperation from the other person, or can they be an absolute heels dug in and still this will work?
That's such a good question. I do think there are some tricks that we can use to help other people manage their emotions better as well. So my one rule always, when there is conflict, when there is heightened emotion, and we have a question to ask, there's one word that we have to remove from our vocabulary entirely. Do you know what it is?
Why?
Yes, exactly. But that's a go-to for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Why did you say that? Why did you do that? A much more effective question that won't trigger the amygdala in the same way, that won't put someone on the defensive. A much better question is, can you talk me through your thinking on that? Or what happened to create this reaction? What did you hear me say? What is important to you about that? Versus why is that important? Or why do you care about that? Why do you want that? If we can remove the why and use more of a reporter type question to gain greater insight, because we can get data, we can get real information from a what, when, how type of question. The why question triggers emotion. And there's very little that we can learn from the emotional response around really the true intention.
Yeah. But I'm just thinking it's so interesting when you're talking about these real sort of nitty gritty practical things that you're not just talking about them in a sort of I'm a smart book sense person, but you've actually done this. So you know this stuff works. If there are people listening today to this podcast and they're sitting there thinking, my aspiration is an amicable divorce, but I don't feel like I'm there yet. What would be the one or two things you would want them to take away today that would help them get closer to it?
That is such a good question. I think the most important thing is really truly seeing the future that you want to create and that you want to live. And if that's the future that you want, in the moment, are you willing to give up something you believe you deserve or need in favor of fair?
So that real creation of the vision or the goal that you're trying to achieve, if you can really focus on that, really get a clear sense of what that would give, not just you, but the family as a whole, that's the guiding principle that will get you over some of the humps and nitty gritty disagreements that you might have over the way. And it will allow you, the strong vision will allow you to give up things that might feel very important to you at the very beginning of the process or sitting right here, right now in the abstract.
Absolutely. If we know what we want for our future, and that is peace, it's co-parenting, it's kindness, it's grace, it's a central nervous system that is calm. If we know that that's what we want and how we want to live and how we want to feel, then fighting for something that we believe is so important in the moment may take us away from that end goal. So there were certainly times in my process where I felt strongly about something, but not strongly enough to fight about it.
Yeah. And just finally then, Allison, if you had to say in a sentence what an amicable divorce had done for you and your family, what would you say?
It's created a space for more love in our lives. I think it's as simple as that. There's so much more good than pain.
Beautifully put. Thank you. Where can people find out more about you, Allison, if they're interested in hearing you talk or finding out more about what you do and the methods that you practice?
Yeah, please connect with me on LinkedIn, Allison O'Brien, Echo Listening Intelligence. You can look for our company name that way to learn more about the science of listening, but connect with me through LinkedIn. That's the best way.
And we'll put in the show notes all details of how to do that as well. So you don't have to keep rewinding this bit if you want to catch Allison in person. Don't forget as well, people, for separating and co-parenting advice and support, you can visit amicable.co.uk, where you can explore all of the different resources that we have, and you can book a free advice consultation as well. If you've enjoyed this episode of the podcast, you can subscribe for updates by visiting thedivorcepodcast.com, or you can find us on your favorite listening platforms too. And don't forget, we'd love to hear about your questions and the things that you're interested in too. So if you'd like to share questions about divorce or separation or co-parenting, then you can do that with us at hello@amicable.co.uk. And you never know, they might form the basis of the next podcast episode. So please do get in touch. Thank you so much, Allison, for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. And thank you, everyone, for listening.